want to do my best to explain this to you. I'm not an expert, but I read the experts and I've talked to enough people. So let me step back, and I want to be sensitive and delicate to the question of why is it that there's so much anti-Semitism pouring out all over the world? To begin, we've got to go back to part of the beginning. In the early Christian church, we're talking Roman imperial existence prior to AD 70 and the fall of Jerusalem. What was happening was early Christians still identified as Jewish to a degree or tied into Jews. Jews, because of their nature and their religion, had special protections in the Roman Empire. While most people were forced to worship the Roman gods, the Romans understood it. These people, you're not going to force them to worship the Roman gods. They'd rather be annihilated than worship the Roman gods. So Jews were given allowances to worship God as they so chose, the real God. Christians were going to the synagogues. But over time, the Christians were saying that, hey, God's come back already. His name's Jesus. He rose again from the dead, and that's actually Yahweh. That's God. And the Jews were like, nope, no, it's not. And the Jews began pushing the Christians out of the synagogues. Some of the early Christians, and then with the rise of Constantine and the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, began openly blaming the Jews for killing Christ. They blamed the Jews, not humanity, not sinners, but Jews. And thus began the rise of Christian anti-Semitism in the West. People who pay back to the Jews decided to slander the Jews. Yes, it's true. It was the Sanhedrin, and it was the Jewish leaders of Jerusalem, but it was also the Romans. And if you actually read the story, it's humanity itself, the fallen world, the sinners of the world. The only reason the Jews killed Christ is because Jesus was Jewish. If Jesus had actually been born in the Germanic period, we'd be blaming the Germans. It's just where he was as a geolocation matter and who he descended from. And Christians slandered the Jews. And if you go to the early reformers in the Christian church, Martin Luther and others, they were very anti-Semitic. And there are some who argue that their anti-Semitism came from the Catholicy of the era. The Catholics of the era were deeply anti-Semitic. Martin Luther, who had been a Catholic priest, came from that tradition and blasted the Jews and wanted them to embrace Christ. And a lot of Christian literature in the Renaissance and the late Renaissance era and the Reformation period was deeply anti-Semitic. And it spread through Europe. And in spreading through Europe, something else happened. If you read the Bible, one of the reasons the Jews were sent into exile to Babylon is they never did a jubilee. They never forgave people their debts. They would charge high rates on loans. It's one of the parables of the shrewd business manager that Jesus talks about, where he forgives a lot of debts. What it was is you weren't allowed to charge usury rates. You weren't allowed to charge interest in the Old Testament. And what they would do is they would just charge inflated rates for lending money. They would charge you a lot of extra money. And he was cutting the rates back to what they should have been to get himself in good before he lost his job. And in the Middle Ages, the Catholics and then the Protestants who came out of the Reformation forced the Jews to be the money lenders because they viewed it as sinful. And so the Christians forced the Jews into the businesses that the Christians believed they themselves should have no business doing under Scripture. And so the Jews became the entertainers because it was sinful to be on stage as an actor. A lot of people of the day, the Puritans and others, they wanted to be entertained, but they didn't want to do the entertaining because that would be sinful. So they made the Jews be the actors. They made the Jews be the bankers and the moneylenders. So guess what happened over time? Jewish people who were forced into these jobs if they wanted to make a living became really good at the jobs, which allowed the twisting anti-Semitism to then say, hey, look at this. The Jews control the banks. The Jews control the money. The Jews control Hollywood. Well, yeah, because you idiots forced them to. You idiots, you're the ones who made them do it, and they got really good at it, and they began providing a living for themselves and others, and they got really good at it because you people didn't want to get your hands dirty, so you made them get their hands dirty, and now you're twisted, and so you get to the rise of Adolf Hitler. And what Adolf Hitler did is he said, look at the Jews controlling the world, controlling the money, controlling all these things. Well, yes, because you forced them to. And now you're using them as a scapegoat because you can't accept blame for your own responsibility. So the history of European civilization, going back to the church period, was you blamed the Jews for everything that went wrong, so you didn't have to accept responsibility for your own problems and your own sins. You blame them for killing Jesus. You blame them for controlling the banking system. You blame them in this country for controlling Hollywood, and you're the one who made them do it. God forbid you blame yourself. The Nazis, meanwhile, were picking up the pieces of the Ottoman Empire. Hitler coveted expansion. And so a lot of the Arab parties that existed after the Ottomans, they went to Germany because Germany was the intellectual capital of Europe, and they went for Western ideas in Germany. And guess what they learned in Germany? These Arab parties, they learned about how the Jews were bad and controlled banking and finance and were all the actors and controlled America. And you had the Rothschilds and others, and you had all these sinister anti-Semitic conspiracies being taught by the Germans to the Arab parties, including the Baathists. The Baathists were the Arab Nazi Party and the Muslim Brotherhood, which Hamas spun out of. They were all in Germany getting educated before and during World War II, and then they went back to their Arab lands. And they began teaching their children about how bad the Jews had become in Europe. Hitler tries to exterminate the Jews. After the war is over, the European powers, realizing, you know what, we really screwed this thing up, and we need to do something, they send the Jews back to Israel, their native land. Now, you got to go back in history to AD 70, where the Romans tore down the temple, but they allowed the Jews to stay until Hadrian, in I think AD 135 or 136 somewhere, purged them and forced the Jews out of Israel. In fact, told them, you're not allowed to live here anymore. He renamed the Roman province of Judea, which is Israel, renamed it to Palestine as a slight to the Jews, designed willfully to insult them because Palestine was the Latin translation for the Philistines. And he allowed Arab tribal pilgrims to move in. Now, they weren't Muslim at the time. Islam was not yet a thing. These were all a bunch of disparate tribes. It was only hundreds of years later that Muhammad united these people, conquered them, converted them all to Islam, and they became Muslim Arabs. They were Arab tribes that had various pagan religions until Muhammad slaughtered the pagans and converted the others to Islam, and there they were in the Jewish lands that the Romans wouldn't allow the Jews to exist in. Well, after Hadrian died, you get to Diocletian, and then you get to Constantine. Constantine didn't want the Jews anywhere around him because, they killed Jesus. So he told them, you can go back to Israel. And they settled there peacefully by and large until the 1900s, when all these Arab leaders who had gone to Germany to learn how to do science and government came back and were like, hey, did you know these people? They're really bad. We should kill them. And then you had this colonizer theories started cropping up that the Jews were actually Europeans who were colonizing the Middle East. Look, they didn't look like the native Middle Easterners. Their skin color was lighter. They sounded more European. They had European ways. Clearly, they're not one of us. Clearly, they're colonizers. Never mind, it was their native lands. And those ideas began to spread through the Arab world. The Palestinians were never liked by the other Arab countries. But those Arab countries, after the fall of the British imperial hold in the Middle East after World War II, began to identify with the Palestinian cause because they needed to keep their people contained and controlled. And so, just like the Germans and the Europeans, they blamed the Jews for everything. So they did not have to account for the fact that they and their people were living in squalor. The leaders were getting wealthy. The people were living in squalor. It was easier to blame the Jews than accept responsibility. And that tended to be the historic situation. The Jews were blamed for every problem to avoid the other leaders having to account for their own failures. It invaded then the intellectual thinking of the Arab world thanks to the Nazis. And then it invaded the academy thanks to the communists. And it has spread around the world as this colonizer decolonization philosophy pronounced by Marxists in the academy has indoctrinated students over time. And the Jews, because so many of them had come from Europe to Israel after World War II, were perceived as European colonizers, pay no attention to history, because the common thread through all of this is that progressivism has no sense of history. You don't need to know history if you're a progressive. History repeats itself. You start from day one, here today, and you move forward. History repeats itself, and you find scapegoats. That's progressivism. It's woven in with Nazism and Marxism, with communism, and all of it needed a scapegoat to avoid accepting blame for failures, and all of them have blamed the Jews. And it's playing out now on college campuses and around the world as many failed Arab governments and European governments and failed academics, instead of accounting for truth and history and the way the world works, would rather peddle conspiracy theories against the Jews. Christians in the United States have largely avoided the medieval and Reformation period blaming of Jews for killing Jesus. By the 1900s, the 1800s and the 1900s, Christianity had sorted itself out on that point, and a lot of the American evangelicals, even going back to the 17 and 1800s, Jonathan Edwards and the like, were very clear that the moral of the story is not that the Jews killed Jesus, but humanity itself did. All people everywhere were to blame. But in Europe, they blamed the Jews. And they pointed to the positions and to the power that they put the Jews in finance and industry and the academy and Hollywood even. And they said, look at them, they've taken this over. Well, yes, they did. They had to, because you forced them to, and they got good at it, and now you hate them for it. The history of anti-Semitism is boiled down to this. A whole lot of people did a whole lot of bad things, and instead of accepting responsibility for the bad things they did, they decided they wanted to blame the Jews, because everyone everywhere always likes a scapegoat, and sadly, through too much of history, the Jews have been the scapegoat for too much of the world.